Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Cam Webster, and welcome to The Art of Boring, the podcast where we dive deeper into Moore's investment philosophy and thinking in order to help you, our listeners, become more informed investors. Ultimately, we hope to connect you with the people at Moore who find excitement in delivering on Be Boring, Make Money.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. Information relating to investment approaches or individual investments should not be construed as advice or endorsement. Any views expressed in this podcast are based upon the information available at the time and are subject to change.
Welcome to the show. Today we have Amit Shah from the U.S. equity team to speak about healthcare specifically. The reason we have Amit on to speak about healthcare is he has a PhD in neuroscience, so we were quite curious about that. So welcome to the show, Amit.
Yeah, thanks. Good to be here.
Glad you could spend some time with us. Why don't we start with kind of for me, it's very curious how a PhD in neuroscience ends up as an equity analyst at Moore Investment Management. So give us kind of your journey here.
Sure. I certainly have an atypical background. I've got a PhD in neuroscience from Michigan State University. What I was doing over there is working or trying to come up with a better mousetrap for curing hypertension. I just wasn't happy with how my career was progressing. And so I signed up to do an MBA at Rotman University in Toronto and just explored some career options over there. One of those that struck with me right away was investing. It's something that I had done on the side since I was a teenager and got the opportunity to try it out professionally, I guess, during a summer internship.
How was your success as a teenager as an investor?
I don't think I was overly competent, but I was very, very interested. And so I'd always read up on stuff as much as I could about investing. And then I was lucky enough to get a summer internship over here at Moore, tried that out and came back here full time. Been here nearly 3 years now. So yeah, I think I've just been fortunate to try out an alternate career and it ended up being something that I enjoyed even more than science, being a scientist. So it certainly raises some eyebrows with friends that I talk to in science, but yeah.
So you're in a lab environment at Moore, but a lot different than trying to build a better mousetrap for hypertension.
Absolutely. Okay. Gone from studying science to studying J&J and companies.
Yeah, so that's a good segue into why you're here. We wanted to get your take on how the healthcare industry is shaking out in the U.S. It's a big component of the market. So about 15% of the S&P 500 market cap is healthcare. So do we care about it in the portfolio just because of that?
I think we're more bottom up. And so we look at companies just based on our investing philosophy, wealth creating companies, good management teams, trading at a fair price, and there happen to be quite a few of those in the healthcare sector. So yeah, that's what we care about.
All right. So what you've done in your time with the U.S. equity team, my understanding is that you've done a couple of those now.
Yeah.
So why don't we just dive into what were your initial thoughts in terms of what's the value of doing a deep dive in healthcare?
Yeah, maybe to take a step back. So the initial idea for this is actually kind of neat, and I think it speaks to the culture over here. I basically came in as a summer intern in 2015, and I was working on what every other analyst over here works on, just trying to look at companies, analyze them, and try to pick good investment ideas. I think the first company I worked on was American Express. Anyways, I wrapped up the work on American Express, and the question I was asked is, what do you want to do next? And one of the first things I thought about is, let's look at the healthcare space, let's look for good investment ideas over there. And I was immediately encouraged to go ahead and do that, try it out. That was how the idea came about, just to look at healthcare and look for places in healthcare where we might have an edge.
So on that first deep dive, what did you come up with in terms of insights?
I went into the analysis with a really, really naive idea that just because I had studied biomolecular pathways for several years, that maybe I had an edge in terms of looking at pharma companies. And I realized very quickly that there's many other people that have the same hypothesis and they're doing this on a full-time basis. And so it's really hard to find an edge specifically in that. Moreover, it's a very probabilistic thing, right? R&D within pharma companies. I mean, when you think about it, the average estimated probability of success for a drug that goes from bench to bedside is 10%.
Okay.
And so
Sorry, you said bench to bedside?
Yeah.
Okay, so from lab bench
right, exactly,
to actually being administered in a therapeutic environment. Okay.
But given that realization, one of the things that surprised me at the time was why there are so many of these biotech companies that are trading at a very high valuation. And some of the companies that we looked at back then were Celgene, Regeneron, Biogen, some of the bigger biotech companies in the space. And I think they were trading on the premise that, look, these companies have come out with 1 or 2 drugs that have been successful, and they've got this entire pipeline of drugs that's going to fuel all their future growth. And given our thinking on the probabilistic nature of the pipeline, it was just surprising that this was kind of valuation that was assigned to these companies. And so we were pretty cynical on the success of these companies. We stayed away from them. And if you look at where they're trading now, the prices for many of these companies is lower than what it was back in 2015, whereas the market's appreciated, 40% since then. So it's a pretty big relative loss for these companies. I think it just goes to show the kind of long-term thinking that we have for investing in general. I think if we just focused on the next few quarters, then we'd be pretty tempted by 20 or whatever, 50% growth rates for some of these companies. But we try to think about the next 15 years for a given company, and the kind of valuation that these companies are trading at just didn't make sense to us.
Did you discover an edge in that first deep dive, or where have you come from since 2015?
Yeah, so when we look at some of these healthcare companies, what we try not to do is spend a lot of time in projecting out the drug pipeline of these companies. Instead, I think we try to look for companies that have assets, current assets that is, that are going to account for a lot of the value of the company. And we also try to look for companies that have a structural advantage. So this might be just good management teams or something else. Maybe one example of that is a company called Johnson & Johnson. And so this is basically a conglomerate in the healthcare space, right? So they've got a pharmaceutical business that accounts for 60% of their profitability. And then the rest of the business is selling medical devices, various types of medical devices, and also various consumer health products. So you have this cash flow profile, which is pretty unique to Johnson & Johnson, where the 60% of the business that's pharmaceutical, that's a little bit cyclical in nature as drugs are coming off, drugs are coming on. But then the rest of the business is not as cyclical. So that gives them perhaps a structural advantage relative to other companies in the space that are just focused on pharmaceutical drugs. And then the other thing about J&J is that they have a large proportion of drugs that are biological in nature. And what this means is that when they fall off patent, they're not affected by the same patent cliff as conventional drugs, where you might lose 80% of revenues right away. In fact, J&J, they've got a drug called Remicade that's coming off patent, and the progression in terms of revenue decline has been slower to a rate of 15% a year.
What's the reason the off-patent decline doesn't happen as quickly?
Biologic drug would just be harder to manufacture than a conventional pill-based drug.
Okay.
And so that's part of the reason why barriers to entry are a little bit higher and the revenue decline is not quite as high as for a conventional drug.
I want to circle back to the probabilistic nature you mentioned when you were talking about biotech companies. And I know our valuation methodology and our mental model is to think probabilistically, but as it applies specifically to healthcare, do you build a model any differently? Is the distribution different in terms of when you're trying to find that intrinsic value? Just talk through how you approach it.
So again, I say that we don't spend a lot of time thinking what the drug pipeline and the value of the drug pipeline would be. We try to find companies that have current assets that feed off of a lot of the valuation. And then the other part of it is, we force ourselves to think probabilistically through a number of different ways. We've got several what-if scenarios, for instance. What if the pipeline doesn't really materialize? What's the value of the company then? And maybe you assign a 5% probability of that happening. What if this drug loses its patent earlier than forecasted? What's the value of the company then? So we've got several of these scenarios that kind of help shape our thinking in terms of the range of outcomes that's possible. And we also have a Monte Carlo analysis built into every DCF model that provides us with that range of output as well. So these are really techniques to just help us think probabilistically about a business model that really is that.
So what I want to do, Amit, is compare where things were in 2015 to now. So what has changed in healthcare since 2015? Nice, small, easy question for you.
There's many things that have changed. Yeah. I think some of the same themes that I noticed back then are still applicable now. So the demographic theme, for instance, where you've got a portion of the population that is aging faster, than the rest of the population. So you've got 3 times the growth rate for the 65 and above population than you do for the rest, for the younger population. And that translates to higher costs in terms of healthcare. And that theme of having cost efficiencies built into the system, perhaps through additional regulation, I think that still applies. Maybe the additional theme as well that I observed this time around was that there's new breakthroughs happening in science, especially in the area of gene therapy. And this could perhaps lead to higher R&D productivity over time.
That's interesting. Okay, the science is moving along and progressing, and maybe not the flavor of the month, but the directional theme is that gene therapy seems to be gaining traction. But what about gene therapy comparatively make you say that there's a possibility that it's a productivity increase on R&D?
Yeah, so maybe just gene therapy, to take a step back, is a therapeutic that's designed to either turn on a gene, turn off a gene. There's different varieties of it. And so this is not a new concept. It was discovered and experimented on several decades ago, but it's only now that there's FDA-approved therapies on the market that cater to gene therapy. And so I was really curious about what impact this might have on R&D productivity, and I went out to this pharmaceutical conference for investors that invite small and mid-sized pharmaceutical companies. One of the companies I talked to over there was called Spark Therapeutics, and they've just come out, I believe, a year and a half ago with one of the first FDA-approved gene therapy drugs. And so the takeaway from that management meeting was that one of the things they talked about is just that the cost of development for a gene therapy drug might be less than the conventional therapy. This is because these diseases tend to be rare diseases. And so it's just not feasible to recruit hundreds of patients for a clinical trial for these when the entire disease might affect 1,000 or 2,000 patients globally. And so the costs related to just the clinical trials and development are lower. And also the costs related to development of these might be lower because you already know the molecular pathway that you want to target. All you need to do is come up with the therapeutic to specifically turn that on or off rather than basically discover an entire new molecular pathway. So these are some of the things that might lead to lower costs for development of these drugs and might lead to higher R&D productivity.
If you're looking at a business like that, is it attractive or not? Because yes, the R&D might be less costly, so margins might be wider, but 2,000 patients, that doesn't sound like a big market.
Absolutely. I think you're right to point out the economics of this are very different. So the drug that I talked about that Spark Therapeutics developed, it's called Luxturna, and they priced it at $1 million on a gross basis. And so
per application?
That's right.
Like 2,000 people times that price.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very different. I think it's still an open question as to whether or not these economics are sustainable. It's an area that clearly the larger companies want to get involved in. The story behind Spark Therapeutics specifically is that it is being considered for takeover by a much larger company, Roche Pharmaceuticals, which is a holding in our international equity fund. And so, yeah, it's an example of how insight developed from a company in the US space might translate over to some of the other funds as well.
Quick follow-on to that. So what would Roche find attractive in that? Would Roche have the ability to scale it up?
That's, I think, part of it, that they would have the distribution networks in place to be able to basically target every single person with that disease. And I think the other thing that they could take from it is the expertise involved. Spark Therapeutics, they talk about having some of the best scientists on the team working on gene therapy. And so I think that's something that Roche could certainly benefit from.
Okay, thanks for that perspective. Your recent examination of the healthcare space, what type of investment ideas came out of that? Is there any holding in the portfolio now as a result of that examination?
Yeah, sometime in between the first deep dive that I did 4 years ago to one that I did a few months ago, one of the companies that came up is one that benefits from these themes that I talked about in terms of an aging population, as well as just more breakthroughs in science leading to new therapies on the market. The company is called Waters, and what they do is sell equipment and consumables to the healthcare space. This is most of their business. The specific equipment is actually something called liquid chromatography machine. Basically, it takes a drug and divides it into subcomponents so that you can easily identify that that drug is what you think it is. So you can imagine that's pretty helpful for quality testing of drugs for pharmaceutical companies. it's also helpful in researching new drugs. So this is a company which not only has a good business model, I mean, it's a boring business, it's a wealth-creating business, but they also have a good management team and a reasonable valuation.
Anything else from the re-examination in terms of investment ideas? And what are you looking at in terms of implementing from your learnings?
I think one of the things that we try to do is win by not losing, right? And so while there might not be any direct investment ideas that come out of one of these analyses that we do, it might be areas that we choose not to focus on because they seem unattractive. And so one of these areas specifically is hospitals. And the underlying theme over there is just the US healthcare system moving from fee-for-service to fee-for-value. And the distinction over there is basically hospitals, instead of being reimbursed in terms of quantity, they'll be reimbursed in terms of quality. And so you can imagine it's going to lead to perhaps more cost efficiencies within the system, and it could lead to lower revenues for hospitals. The fee-for-service, I think, is easy to grasp. You get 10 diagnostic tests done on you, and you get paid for each of those. The fee-for-value, it's not an easy concept, and it's still a work in progress. I think some of the quality metrics that are being looked at are mortality rates, readmission rates. And so if a patient has fewer infections, then that could lead to fewer readmissions. And so the hospital would get reimbursed for providing a better quality of service for this.
Okay. And where's that pressure coming from? Is it coming from governments who are largely funding the bill? Insurance companies? Like, where's that pressure that hospitals are experiencing coming from?
Yeah, it's a mix of both. It's government funding through Medicare, Medicaid that is now being associated with a lot of these quality metrics, and private payers as well are adopting.
Okay. So big change, potentially less cost overall in the system. What does that mean for investments we hold that may have exposure to hospitals?
I think it could be a potential risk for suppliers to hospitals, and the one that comes to mind is Becton Dickinson, which just makes several products that go into hospitals, like needles, like catheters, for instance. And yeah, so clearly now this is a risk that we're more aware of and are monitoring actively. But it's also important to keep in mind that this whole shift towards fee for value is happening pretty slowly right now, and there might be offsets to it. So companies like Becton Dickinson, I think they're very focused on innovations that help increase their pricing pressure. So one of the things that they do is provide a whole suite of anti-infective products. And hospital-associated infections is something that costs the U.S. $10 billion a year. And so you can imagine how having these suite of products can be helpful.
So I want to round out our conversation with a nice, easy question. Going back to your background as a neuroscientist, where do you think neuroscience is going to be in 10 years? Give us some insight into where it might be going.
Your guess is probably as good as mine.
No. I don't have a PhD in neuroscience, Amit.
Fair enough. I guess I'm very optimistic on what can happen. One of the things I was reading is that just if you look at breast cancer, the mortality rate for breast cancer over the last 40 years has gone down by 30%. And there's so many neurological diseases like Alzheimer's that affect 500,000 people, or 500,000 new cases of Alzheimer's are going to come out in the US this year. So, things like that, they're a very large problem. And I think they're getting more and more attention, more and more R&D dollars. And so I'm pretty optimistic that even within our lifetime, we'll see some changes, some new drugs.
Well, thanks for spending time with us, Amit. Very, very interesting walk through healthcare, and keep up the good work.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, everyone. Cam here again. To subscribe to the Art of Boring podcast, go to more, that's mawer.com/podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review on iTunes, which will help more people discover the Be Boring, Make Money philosophy. Again, thanks for listening.